Hello. Welcome back to the Liberation Hour, folks. This is your host, Comrade Felicity, coming at you live from WRFU 104.5 Radio Free Urbana. Yes, folks, I am back here in the studio. The last few weeks, I have not wanted to be in the studio because I was being lazy. It was super cold outside, so I was just like, yeah, what if I just didn't? But I have been recording good content for y'all, and as y'all can see, I am currently, as you know, back in the studio. I love it to see it. We're going to go ahead and do the top of the hour disclaimer. We have a lot to cover today. There is a lot happening. There is a lot, just a lot, just a lot. It's been a lot. And so let's go ahead and get this started. WRFU is an open forum for the Urbana-Champaign online community. Views expressed are those of the speakers and are not intended to represent WRFU UC-IMC. Folks, welcome back to the show. Yes. If you didn't know, this is our 29th episode. Yes, and so that means next week will be our 30th episode on the air. Isn't that crazy? We've been doing this for 30 episodes now. That's 30 hours of content that I have been churning out. I'm pretty proud of it, low key. I'm feeling good about it. I think that this has been such a fun show to be doing, and I'm so happy that I have been able to provide this for everyone. And for y'all, and you know, to continue to support the community through, you know, on the air and in real life, organizing on the ground. So yeah, thank you all for making this possible, for listening in, for commenting if you watch on the YouTube and everything. And yeah, I just appreciate the support that I've gotten so far, and I hope to continue to grow the show and help grow the movement with the little that I can do as an individual and part of an organization. And so apart from that, oh my God, guys, so much has happened in the last week. As you know, so there has been a lot of geopolitical things going on, of course, but there's also been a lot of domestic stuff going on at home. I want to cover, I want to cover a few different things actually today while we're live, because my segment for oh yes, the last 30 minutes of the show is on fascism with Comrades Camilo and Markus, returning to the show once again. And yeah, I think that it's a pretty pertinent topic as topics go. I've been wanting to do an episode on fascism for a while, and I also think it should be said that a lot of these topics are ongoing conversations. Recently, I just did an episode with Comrade Misha on China and Chinese communism and Chinese imperialism more specifically. That was a great episode, and it's going to be a continuing episode. It's going to be a continuing series of discussion because we have so much to cover. Fascism is more than just, you know, there's so much to cover. There's so much to learn about it. There's so many movements that have sprung up from the ideology. You know, obviously the most horrific, the biggest is most certainly the Nazi Party back in Germany in the 1930s and 40s. But there's also a lot of other fascist movements that have happened in recent decades, and you know, an ideology which supported fascism becoming what it has become. And so I think that, you know, I'm excited to show the episode. I'm excited to, you know, put the full segment on YouTube. But to first, I think, outline fascism, I want to talk about, you know, in this modern media and what has been going on in the past week, the discussion around things like the Epstein files. We are going to be talking about that today. There's a lot to cover there. As you, if you've been living under a rock, the FBI just released 3 million more documents, a lot of damning evidence. It's been pretty. I mean, I don't want to say shocking because it's not like we didn't already know that these things were happening, but I have to say, just really sad. More than anything, you know, we all knew, and I guess I can just go ahead and talk about it now. You know, we all knew that you know, Donald Trump and all of, you know, his people and many Democrats and just people in power in general have been involved with this person. You know, I don't think it's as surprising seeing their names. It's more just heartbreaking knowing what those victims went through. Because these are extremely cruel, disgusting people who took just full advantage of young women and young girls who were often, this was actually an interesting point because I've been listening to a lot of coverage on the subject to kind of prepare myself to come on air today. A lot of the young women who were trafficked, fun fact, were from former Soviet countries or Soviet. Before the Soviet Union fell, there was a lot of different countries within the Union, and after the Soviet Union fell, a lot of those countries fell into disrepair. They have been breeding grounds for situations just like this, where a lot of opportunist people, including Epstein himself, saw the fall of the Soviet Union and saw an opportunity to take advantage of the young women who were, the young people in general, who were becoming victim to neoliberal reforms and basically states that were now fully liberalized and no longer supporting them through communism. And it's so incredibly sad to hear that a lot of young Ukrainian women, young Russian women have been trafficked by Epstein. This is not specific to America. This is across the globe. Young women being taken advantage of and being brutally assaulted by these people, by these men in power and men and women, I should say, because Ghislaine Maxwell was just as instrumental in the process of trafficking young women as Jeffrey Epstein was. I often think back to this documentary that I watched about R. Kelly, actually, and it's called Surviving R. Kelly. I'm sure it got pretty popular after it came out. I'm sure plenty of listeners probably know about it. But there's this conversation around R. Kelly being illiterate and the fact that he had this beautiful voice and he could make amazing music, but his problem, one of his biggest issues, is that he was illiterate and he couldn't read or he couldn't write very well. And so turn down my volume there. So that concept, and then on top of that, the reason that's important is because that required him to need other people to help him traffic young women, which is what he was doing, on the scale that he was. This required a level of complicity that essentially not only implicates the person that was actually doing the sex crimes, but the people who were supporting that person in doing sex crimes, and in trafficking young people, and in some cases murder, and in many cases, trying to keep them quiet, trying to make sure that they don't say anything, because this is a system that is also extremely delicate. A lot of these rich, powerful men in power understand that not only did Epstein did he function as basically a pimp for the elite class, he also functioned as an asset to intelligence. And so that made him, in some ways, kind of untouchable until the very end. We can see that when in 2008 he was convicted of, he was convicted of child molestation, and he was known at that point to be a child predator, but was given a sweetheart deal by Alexander Acosta and his legal team most likely because he's an asset, not only to the CIA, but also to Mossad, also to the Saudi government. He is one of those nodes, one of those brokers that kind of supports this larger system of communication between elites, not only for geopolitical reasons, but also, as I just mentioned, him being a pimp. And to bring it back to my R. Kelly discussion that I was bringing into this, part of the reason I brought that up is because if you couldn't tell from the Epstein files that have been released, Epstein was really stupid. This was not some kind of super genius that a lot of people try to paint him as, how was he hidden in the shadows for so long? It's because he was rich and he was being supported by intelligence agencies that used him as an asset to not only gather intelligence, but to also connect different stakeholders to, do different projects and to, do their bidding and what they wanted. So Epstein could not have been acting alone. And we know this, of course, because he was supplying young women to many different ritual leads. But what I'm talking about is, he had to have people on his side. He had to have people who were not only, who were basically doing that for him, doing this work, doing this, basically like, the paperwork part, the grunt work, essentially. There had to be people working for him, and we know this. It's in the files. And one of those people was Ghislaine Maxwell, and she's in prison now, albeit way too nice of a prison for her, because she is cooperating with the Trump administration to make sure that nothing gets out, because they realize that this is really bad for their boy. Trump's name was mentioned, I want to say, 5,000 times in the files? That's insane. That's a lot of times to be mentioned in the Epstein files, man. I don't know. That's, and I think, bringing this into a larger conversation around the MAGA movement as well, this just goes to show how spineless so many of those people in that movement are, just by how they reacted to the Epstein stuff, because so many of them were trying to, do this whole, like, we need to drain the swamp, we need to release the files, we need to find the elite pedophile cabal, which ultimately that whole conspiracy theory, while partly true, was also based on things like Pizzagate, which was not true, as we know, because as in this release of the files, we can see that they didn't use any code words. They would just say, yeah, I'm going to go rape someone. What? Like, this just goes to show that, yeah, no, it didn't really mean anything. Like the whole, so many of these right-wingers were like, oh, they're using all of this secret code, and we have to basically go through and try to figure out what they're saying. What does it all mean? And it's like, no, they would just say it out loud. It's kind of like how in CIA memos that have been released, from past decades of their shenanigans, you can see that, like, they just write everything down. Like, it's all right there. You can, the thing is, like, in intelligence, they still have to keep record. They still have to know, they can't just lie about everything on paper as well, because then it's like, what's true? You can't keep it all up here in your head. That's virtually almost impossible for most people. And so, yeah, you have to write things down. You have to keep records. You have to, do all of that XYZ to be able to maintain a level of security and continue to do missions and projects. And Epstein, in his emails, when you're seeing these things, one thing that this was actually mentioned on the Chapo Trap House most recent episode that they just put out. I know I've talked crap about them before. I still do listen. I think they're funny. But this most recent episode was them talking about how in so many emails you can just see, like, random equal signs throughout sentences that Epstein would be writing. And when I saw that on my own at first, when I was just looking through some of the documents, and I was like, what is that? What does this mean? And then Felix brought up a good point on the show where he was like, this is a classic case of when you give your grandparents an iPad and or a phone or something, and they don't know how to type or use it, and so you end up getting that situation. I just honestly, Epstein was not a smart person. I feel like there's this whole mythology around him, especially from right-wingers, and we're going to get into this as well with the Nick Fuentes stuff. Nick Fuentes has recently, if you don't know who Nick Fuentes is, he is sees himself as some kind of king of the groypers. He is king of nothing. He is a loser. He's a manlet, as Hassan said on his stream once, which I thought was pretty funny. He's just a guy. And he, God, he was trying to do this whole pivot where he's like, actually, Epstein was cool. It's not bad that he was a pedophile. It's bad that he was a Jew. And it's like, no, I don't think anyone's buying that. Like, here's the thing. There's probably people in his audience that are genuinely like, yeah, that's why Epstein was the worst. But I don't really think anyone is actually buying that bull. Like, and even some of the most right-wing people that I know in my life would not make that argument because it's a bad argument. And you can tell that he's just kind of running out of tricks. Like, Nick Fuentes is the kind of person who is trying to be the most shocking. He's there for shock value. He doesn't necessarily believe in anything. I mean, I'm sure he probably is kind of a neo-Nazi. But most of what the content he's trying to put out is meant to shock you. It's meant to make you go, oh my God, that's crazy. Why would you say that? And the point is to keep people drawn in. It's to keep you locked in on what he is saying. It's to keep you saying, well, what he's going to say next. Well, why would he say such an outrageous thing? That's kind of the point. The point is that Nick Fuentes and people like him, when they cover situations like this, what they want is to keep your attention for as long as possible. And they want to basically say the most outrageous things that will stick with you, that will make you talk about them. Because what does that do? It gives them exposure. Part of the reason I'm talking about Nick Fuentes right now is because he's kind of overstepped that a little bit. You can see with his latest grift, trying to sell Epstein merch, ? And I'm sure he's probably getting buyers because, his audience are, people who probably haven't left their basement, in like 6 months. But frankly, I don't think that this is a good move for him. And I've been kind of keeping an eye on what a lot of these fascists do and watch and say. This is not a good look for him, even for Nick Fuentes. And Nick Fuentes is basically the bottom of the barrel. Like, there's no much, you don't go much lower than that. With this whole Epstein situation and all of the Epstein coverage, watching his kind of strange little crash out of him, like, trying to defend Epstein, like, no one in their right mind is trying to defend that man. Or any of the people that he that he supplied children to, and the people that are, I mean, I'm sure there's probably a lot more people that are actually trying to defend Donald Trump, but that's because they're in a MAGA cult. I mean, we know this already. They are in a cult. They have a cult-like mindset. Although, this is interesting. There's a guy, I think he was the guy that dressed up or something for January 6th. And this man, even after he got released from prison by Trump, and and he's still a right wing, he's still a nut, he's still a right wing nut. But after Trump didn't immediately release the files, one of the main guys in January 6th left the MAGA movement, and I have to say that's hilarious. Like, that is one principled man, and I'm not at all supporting his beliefs. I'm sure he still has terrible beliefs, but to the right-wingers who kind of opened their eyes and saw that Trump didn't immediately release the files, and so he was probably implicated and chose to chose to leave, props to you guys. And I'm not going to do that very often because, that's kind of the bare minimum. But the fact that I think that moment really opened a lot of people's eyes to the idea that, wait, maybe this isn't, wait a second, maybe I need to take a step back here. I've been missing something. That takes a certain amount of self-reflection that I think needs to be recognized. It takes a certain amount of self-reflection to say, was I wrong? Because you can see with the MAGA people who are still supporting Trump, even now with all of the Epstein stuff and the fact that he most certainly did some terrible, terrible things, you can see with the ones who are still following him and supporting him, there's nothing going on up there. This has never been about draining the swamp or any of those things. This has been purely out of a cult-like mindset around him and his influence and the things that he says, because ultimately they're angry about their lives and they're resentful. They'll find any reason to try to support him, even though, he's a pedophile. Because these are unprincipled people. The right-wingers who actually left the MAGA movement, I have to give my props to. That's the bare minimum. You should be doing better. But that's a first step. That is a huge thing to realize, wait, maybe my guy wasn't my guy. I know of plenty of Democrats who, will still support the Democratic Party after they do some of the most heinous things, after they throw us under the bus constantly. There will still be people who are like, no, but there are only option. Vote blue no matter who. And it's like, no, we're not doing all that. There are some Democrats who are still convinced that we just need to continue to vote for the Democrats and things will get better. So the fact that there are right-wingers who were more willing to realize that Trump might be a pedophile and leave the MAGA movement, these people are more principled than some Democrats, because once again, the Democrats, they aren't anything. They are not worth supporting. And if anything, they are an accomplice to what the Republicans are trying to do and are successfully doing. And people who still support them and still support the party and are still trying to maintain their stronghold on leftist influence or any kind of left or and co-opting leftist movements. If you're still willing to support the Democrats after all that, you're an unprincipled person and you are a worm. I'm sorry, but if you're still willing to support the Democrats after all of that they have done to basically bring down the MAGA movement, bring down any leftist opposition, co-opt it and take advantage of it, and then send billions of dollars to Israel. No, bye. The movement does not need you if you're going to continue to try to support them. And so I have to, once again, I have to give my props to people who are willing to open their eyes and realize, oh, wait, maybe I was wrong. That takes a certain amount of self-reflection that not a ton of people have, unfortunately. I wish it existed more for, people who have left-leaning sympathies. But ultimately, if you were trying to maintain capital, that's where we draw the line, point blank. And of course, pedophilia, draw the line. That's not... That's not a vibe. And Jeffrey Epstein, he definitely did not commit suicide. He definitely did not kill himself. But him being an intelligence asset just goes to show even more, I think, how intelligence works. Because intelligence, in the framework of a Marxist perspective, intelligence is meant to maintain the bourgeois class's stranglehold over the mode of production. They can't necessarily go through legal means all of the time. In fact, most of the time. And I think that, and that's not to say that the legal system is legitimate. It's not. But many of them, rich billionaires and people who have a lot of money, you can bet your whole life savings, which is probably $2,000 if you're like me, that they're probably an intelligence asset, and it's because it is in their best interest to maintain what they have. It is in their best because they realize that if they did not participate in intelligence gathering, in those kind of self-preservation acts to ensure that they maintain a strong stranglehold over the world and the economy and our political situation in our lives, they realize if they don't have that, then they will actually have to face some kind of consequence for what they have done. Jeffrey Epstein realized, and this is, most likely a calculation on his part as well. I am a pedophile. I am a disgusting human being, and if I want to keep doing what I'm going to do, what I want to do, then I have to give up a certain amount of, I have to give myself to these agencies who are going to kind of rely on me for intelligence because that's how he maintains himself. It's mutually assured pedophilia for all of the people involved who he has blackmail on, because if they come out and say Jeffrey Epstein is a terrible person, he's a pedophile, then Jeffrey Epstein can just turn around and release video of them doing terrible things, or leak it to the press or whatever it is. And so it is very much a relationship that the bourgeois class has with each other, an interpersonal relationship that is obviously incredibly toxic, but it is mutually assured destruction. You don't mess with me, I don't mess with you. And we get to maintain our status in society. And we get to maintain this mode of production, which screws over everybody else but us. Of course, no one is, everyone's replaceable. And Jeffrey Epstein is no different. No one is untouchable. And we can see that he could only get away with these things for so long, of course, because he got arrested. And clearly, this became a situation where intelligence communities had to do an assessment. Do we let him possibly squeal and say something, and then the whole thing comes crashing down, or kill him before any of this comes out, kill him before it becomes a problem? Obviously, they made their choice. And this isn't. I know a lot of. I'm not really down with conspiracy theories. This isn't really a theory. I don't feel, because this is just a logical conclusion. If you're an intelligence asset who has been apprehended by the police, who has a huge public-facing story of being an international sex criminal, it is within the intelligence community's best interest to shut him up, completely shut him up. And so that's what happened in 2019. And we're coming to the end of the segment, the live segment, but I really wanted to discuss this Epstein release because I don't want us to lose our revolutionary optimism in the face of this terrible discovery. These last few days, personally, kind of opening up here a little bit myself, I have been facing a deep depression. Knowing exactly what went down, knowing what those young women and girls went through, I felt sick to my stomach. I couldn't get out of bed. Personally, it weighs on you. It really does, because it's the realization of what they went through should never have happened, and it didn't have to happen. And no matter what rich elites tried to tell us, no matter what the bourgeois class tries to tell us, this is a system that we can overturn, that we can destroy, and that we can build something better and new and completely different from this. This is not it. We don't have to stay in this. We don't have to submit to this. And anybody trying to convince us that we can just go through the system itself, that we don't have to destroy it, that we don't have to do class struggle, that we don't have to, upend everything. Don't buy into that narrative, because that will only keep you complacent. People like Epstein deserve to see not only their day in court, but their day on the wall. I saw this tweet, and I'll end this segment out like this. Communism isn't perfect, but under a dictatorship of the proletariat, all of those monsters in the Epstein files would have been shot. So I'll leave you guys with that. And I'm going to go ahead and play my segment on fascism with Comrades Camilo and Markus. And I appreciate you all tuning in tonight, and I'll see you next week.
Okay, so welcome back to the show, Comrades Camilo and Markus. We have a very interesting topic today, which is on the subject of fascism. And there's a lot to cover. There is so much to learn about and discuss. There's a lot of literature on the subject. I know I have professors that have recommended the book On the Anatomy of Fascism by Robert Paxton. So there is that resource in understanding fascism, but there's also a lot of others as well. So yeah, comrades Camilo and Marcus, if you guys want to quickly introduce yourself and we'll get started.
Well, Marcus, why don't you go first?
All right, yeah. It's Comrade Marcus here once again. Always happy to be here. I did want to mention too, since you brought up books on the subject, our one of our reading groups recently finished Fascism and Social Revolution, and I found that to be an excellent resource for really learning the definition and like what makes up fascism and things leading up to it.
And I am Camilo Lasso. I have the privilege and honor of being the national chair of the APL. And I think this is what, my third appearance on your show, Comrade
Third or
Felicity?
fourth, one of the two.
Third or fourth. I'm glad to be here again.
Yeah, no, definitely a regular and a fan favorite, I have to say. So
Understandable.
yes. Yes. So yeah, I think that there's so much to discuss in this topic. As I said, a lot of academics and scholars, have plenty of theories and discussion on fascism and its characteristics, its tendencies, and what it does. But yeah, I would say, how would we want to define fascism before we get started? Because I feel like we should start off with a solid definition.
Okay, that's the $1,000 question.
I
What
know.
what is fascism?
Not a million.
Yeah, no,
1,000.
just 1,000. Or 64, the old 50s game show, which by the way was, from what I understand, was incredibly corrupt. They were fed the answers. The $64,000 question. But yeah. So what is fascism? People have a hard time with it.
Yeah.
And scholars and academics and political people from the very first had a hard time really coming to grips understanding what fascism is, what it isn't, and what distinguishes it from other types of the repressive bourgeois state. Because I think one of the biggest mistakes that people make is they either equate fascism with just repression. So anything repressive is fascist. No. I mean, even the most democratic states can be repressive in specific instances and contexts.
Right.
Or they'll throw fascism around like an insult term. So yeah, my dad, he's a fascist. Yeah, my dad took away my Xbox. He's a fascist.
Yeah.
And I suppose that's well and fine, using it as a term of abuse. That has its value.
Sure.
But really, what really is it, and what is it that distinguishes it? And part of the problem is that, unlike other political ideologies, fascism really doesn't have a definite body of thought behind it. And what I mean by that is this. So if you want to find out what liberalism is, you could always just go to the library and grab your Adam Smith and your John Locke and your John Stuart Mill, and you can read all about the philosophy of liberalism. You want to find out what Marxism is, need I say more? But fascism doesn't have that. Now, yeah, there is a background to fascism and how it grew as an ideology, and we can get into that. But there is no fascist Bible. What people quite often talk about, Mussolini's, what is fascism? That was written after the fact, after they were already in power, and kind of to justify the positions that he already took. Or they'll cite Mein Kampf. Well, Mein Kampf, aside from being the rantings of a lunatic,
My struggle.
yes, it's very German, and it's very much about German issues in the 19 teens and 20s. It fails as a Bible for fascism, unless you want to find out what Hitler's opinion was about the Center Party in Bavaria in 1922.
Yeah. What
So
was
fascism,
his opinion?
he didn't like it. He didn't like him. So fascism doesn't have that. So it's kind of hard to figure out what fascism is for, because in many ways, fascism is the essence of reaction. It is a reactionary movement. It's easier to tell what fascism is against than it is to tell what fascism is for. And that I think is the starting off point. That's how to begin.
Yeah.
Now,
oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I'm on a roll.
No, you're good. Yeah,
Forgive me,
go ahead.
Felicity. Forgive me, I'm on a roll.
Yeah.
So there is the famous Comintern analysis, or what's been called the Dimitrov formulation of 1935, where it was, okay, so fascism is the openly terroristic dictatorship of the most reactionary elements of finance capital. Okay, that's good. I'm not criticizing that. Obviously, I wouldn't criticize that. But the problem with that, and it's not a problem, but rather the focus there is on a macro level.
Right.
Yeah, that's looking at fascism as a socio-economic phenomenon and as a phase of capitalism. That doesn't explain why someone put on a brown shirt.
I mean, I think it's pretty interesting. I forget where this quote is from, but it's like, when like basically it's like when Germany became fascist and, people started rounding up Jewish people and everything. It's like, it wasn't necessarily, Nazi soldiers. It was the milkman. It was my neighbor, who, were going after people. How did we get to that point?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's kind of similar, I would say, with ICE, where it's like, you know, the guys who join ICE are essentially just like there's a podcast that I listen to from time to time, not as much anymore, but I do some, they are pretty funny. And they said that ICE is currently a war of the unemployed on the employed. And I thought that was kind of interesting. But
there's kind of like any good lie, every good lie, and Hitler and Goebbels would have agreed with this. Any good lie has to have a particle of truth to it, at least.
Right.
So there is a kind of a particle of truth to that.
Yeah. No, it's more of like a funny quip than it is like a reality. But it's just interesting because a lot of the people who joined ICE are people who like this is like some of the most extreme versions of like the Trumpism ideology. And they were just, a lot of them are just regular people. These are not, like ICE guys who join ICE were like regular guys who got radicalized. And, now they are like just like this like civilian like army of like just thugs who want to go and like beat up immigrants.
I've seen
Well,
that a lot of times fascism in one way is described as capitalism in decay. And from my observations, I've found that it seems like, like people are getting frustrated with, you know, um, you know, stagnant wages and rising costs. What else? Not having access to certain goods and services, and um, the the people that start directing that frustration towards other root causes than you know capitalist profiteering. That's what it seems to be. What is causing these people to go to ICE and things like that? Oh, there's all these rising costs, and like my wages aren't going up. It's because all these Hispanics are coming from the South and taking our jobs and working for pennies on the dollar, and they never give a second thought to the person that's hiring these people for pennies on the dollar, or the social and economic situation that they put us in, that like uh our purchasing power and things like that rely upon those kinds of things, because the capitalists have milked all the profit out, that the only way they continue to increase those profits is by looking towards what can be referred to as, wage slavery in a way, in order to keep prices the way they are and maintaining ever increasing profits. And so instead of that anger, that frustration being directed right at them, they point the finger at the Jews, at the Hispanics, immigrants, like anything other than the true root cause.
There's a guy, I think in the 80s, maybe even earlier, who named Theodore Abel, who wrote a book, How Hitler Came to Power. And he looked at the specific example of a small German town called Northeim, and how the Nazis took over Northeim. But in doing that, he also kind of cast his net around all of Germany, and he found out something really interesting because we have election results. So we know who voted for the Nazis.
Ah.
And when you look at those election results and you break them down demographically, a really interesting picture emerges. So, for example, if you looked at an upper class or affluent neighborhood, the vote went for the traditional parties. Liberal Party, Catholic Party, Center Party, the monarchists. Okay, no surprise there. You go to the opposite end and look at poor or working class neighborhoods. The vote went solidly SPD, KPD, Social Democrats and Communists. Okay, no surprise there either. These are the class struggle parties.
Yeah, I mean that's like pretty, I mean parties are like the essence of like, not necessarily the essence, but like the representation of a class, you know, politically. So that's
So no
understandable.
surprise,
No
no
surprise.
surprise, no surprise. Where the surprise comes is when you look at quote unquote middle class neighborhoods, petty bourgeois neighborhoods where people owned their own businesses. That's where the vote went for the Nazis
I wonder why that is.
because they're
That's,
terrified.
yeah.
The petty bourgeoisie is terrified. I mean, the petty bourgeoisie historically is the most unstable class
Hmm.
because they're caught between these two massive forces. They're caught between the bourgeoisie above them and the proletariat below them.
A rock and a hard
And
place.
yeah, and they're terrified of being driven out of business by the bourgeoisie, and they're terrified of falling into the proletariat. Now, in other
Right.
circumstances, this could mean the petty bourgeoisie or some elements of it could be revolutionary in other circumstances. And, it has happened. But it's no surprise that, your typical fascist foot soldier, your black shirt, your brown shirt, came from the petty bourgeoisie. They tended to be small shopkeepers. They tended to be people who had lost their businesses. They tended to, especially the very first fascists, demobilized former soldiers. These were the black shirts. These were the brown shirts. And I think you can see the same thing with Who's in Ice.
That's a very fascinating observation because the area I live in is sees both ends of the middle class spectrum. We have in one area very upper middle class, homeowners and business owners, like you stated, and then also like the lower middle class, like maybe blue collar business owners, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I've noticed, it's both extremes of what American politics, which is really just center and right, or like not as right, I guess. And so like there's very dedicated liberals, Democrats, and there's also very hardcore, conservative, mega types, and there's really no in between.
Yeah.
And that was very eye-opening what you said there, Ed. And I'm seeing it now too.
Yeah, no, I think that it's a very interesting demographic analysis, and it very much speaks to how reactionary sentiment can be fostered through like the class dynamic and like the fear of like I would also like to point out perhaps like the fear of being expropriated,
Mm-hmm.
because the communist parties were so popular, and they did want to like the working class was genuinely trying to change their conditions. Communism was certainly on the rise. The Soviet Union was like just a few states away. Like they're like I can see how the Nazis certainly took advantage of that, and how it's similar with the Trump administration, because when they come after immigrants and they come after people of color and everything, and what they're and all the things that they're doing, and they're playing up people's fears that these people are, if you listen to Trump's speeches, it's always these are deranged criminals, from the psych wards and stuff like that. They're just letting in these deranged criminals, and there are people who genuinely believe that. And most of those people, demographics have changed a little bit over time, and I will say there's a lot more working class people, at least here in the States, who are a lot more reactionary. That's for other reasons, I think, that are unique to the United States. But you also have just like regular middle class people who, really have bought into this. And I don't know, I just find that very interesting, especially people with, some of them have like college education.
Yeah. Well, I think that what's going on and what happened historically is you have two groups of people who, for different reasons, are terrified. So you have the bourgeoisie who is terrified of revolution. And, at least in the 1920s and 30s, the example of the successful Russian Revolution and the creation of the Soviet state, the wave of revolutions that broke out across Europe after World War I, the periodic growth, or rather incremental growth of communist and socialist parties, they were scared out of their minds by that. So when someone comes along, be it a Hitler or a Mussolini, who says, I'll get this under control for you, they'll bankroll it. Now, they might hold their noses or pretend to hold their noses. No, we don't like that
The
Hitler
Koch
ruffian.
brothers.
Yeah, the Hitler ruffian. But they will give them money. Oh, and then later, once the Nazis are in power, these same people who said, we don't like Hitler, but we can use him. Yeah, they'll be the first to shell out bribes to be able to put on an SS uniform. So the Nazis did that too, which is very, very Trump-like. For a price, you can get a rank in the SS and a spiffy Hugo Boss uniform to put on.
Yeah.
So you have that top. Then at the bottom, the other end, you have the petty bourgeoisie that's terrified of being driven out of business, terrified of falling into the working class. In many cases, they've lost their businesses or come back from the war to a society that's in ruins with no possibilities for them. And so they're open to conspiracy theories. They're open to any demagogue that'll say, well, it's this group of people over here. They're the ones that are to blame. It's the Jews and the communists and the liberals and those are the ones that are to blame for your problems.
The demographics who, really go for that rhetoric and that ideology are already primed materially to accept it.
Yeah.
They already have conditions which are, priming them. It's like it's similar to, I would say, communists, how, the conditions of the proletariat are primed for them to accept communism, or at least like solidarity, because they realize, a lot of people realize, socialists often actually work with the masses, unlike other parties, Democrats. And that's not always true. And I would say in the United States, we were just talking about this before we started recording, but a lot of working class people have unfortunately fallen into the Trump train and all of the things that he advocates for and all of the things that he does. And it's quite interesting because a lot of these people are regular poor people who rely on government benefits to survive. Now, a lot of them have, there's a good portion of them that the leopards have now eaten their face.
Mm-hmm.
and it's also on the other dimension as well. If you want to move up classes a little bit, this is a grift. The conservative fascist movement in the United States has very much become a grift. It's a very easy way to make a lot of money. You don't grift to the left. There's no money in being a leftist. You're not getting funded by a leftist billionaire. That's not how that works. If you want to be a grifter, it's the best way to do it is to do what Candace Owens does.
Oh, and grifting is nothing new for fascism. As I said earlier, um, you actually could have made a small contribution to that. They had an organization called Friends of the Reichsfuhrer SS, and it was composed of high-level businessmen and even some aristocrats, some nobles. Um, and for a small price, a small contribution to Heinrich Himmler, you would get a rank in the SS, and like I said, a spiffy little black uniform.
Wow, guys.
And what makes that hilarious is that the SS presented themselves as the warrior elite.
The warrior elite.
A new order of knighthood. That was their public image. And yeah. The warrior elite, you just pay a small fee, you could join the warrior elite. And they did so many things. Like they had Nazi cigarettes.
Oh.
They licensed with some tobacco company. The way many companies do. They'll license some major product and put their own label on it. But they had Nazi cigarettes. So somewhere, someone.
Nowadays, you only get a crummy microwave dinner on a plate in Mar-a-Lago.
Yeah, that's crappy. That's horrible. But yeah, they had Nazi cigarettes. They had like Nazi beer. They had
beer.
Yes, they had all these little products that that the Nazi Party had licensed, and it sold back to its members.
Yeah, no, that is the ultimate grift. That's almost no, it is like I would say one of the biggest characteristics of fascism that I think definitely needs to be addressed is the fascists understand first and foremost that the first people that always have to go in order for them to be successful is any left labor movement that can actually mobilize militantly against them. They know that the liberals are not going to do this because liberals are, at least here in the United States, I'm speaking very much as someone who lives in the United States, I'm speaking from that perspective. But more generally, how likely are liberals to pick up arms and start fighting people? And start.
I would say close to zero.
Close to zero.
Their main motivation it always seems to be just maintaining the status quo.
Very much so.
And that's all.
And fascists understand this, and fascists, I would say, the whole phrase, scratch a liberal and a fascist bleeds. Liberals are very easily co-opted and very quickly capitulate when times get tough because they realize they're not necessarily opposed to the fascist ideology. They might be morally opposed to some of what fascists believe, but ultimately liberals want to maintain capital. They want to maintain the status of capital and what it means in society and how it functions. And so do fascists. They have that interest. And so liberals are much more likely to simply capitulate or not do anything. Fascists realize, those who have gone all the way and who have bought completely into the ideology realize that the only people who can put up a real fight against them are militant left organizations like labor unions and communists and socialists and the parties that represent them.
Yeah. Oh yeah. They know very well who their enemy is. And that's us.
Yeah, and they realize because fascists, I guess it's, while it is hard to define what they are exactly, I guess it could be easier to define what they aren't. as well.
Well, let's pick up on that. Let's pick up on that because
Yeah.
I think that's the perfect starting point. There was an academic named Stanley Payne who he wrote a lot about uh, Spanish fascism. And he wrote probably a groundbreaking book on the Falange, the Spanish Fascist Party. But he also wrote a book on the Franco regime. And there's at one point in this book where he says something that I thought was spot on. Because he starts off saying what we just said. So it's so hard to say what fascism is for. And as a matter of fact, there was even another author many years later, Italian author called De Felice, who said, you can't speak of fascism. You have to speak of hyphenated fascism. Those were his words, hyphenated fascism. And what he meant by that is you can't really say that there is one thing called fascism. Instead, there is radical fascism, clerical fascism, there is cultural fascism, there is Catholic fascism, there is, and then he just lays it on. But Paine said, I really agree with him 100%. But again, it's hard to say what fascism is for. So maybe everyone's been looking in the wrong place, trying to find out what fascism is for. Why don't we start off by looking at what fascism is against? And he starts off by enumerating what he called the three fascist negations.
Hmm.
Fascism is anti-liberal, anti-conservative, although willing to cut deals with the conservative, right?
Right.
And anti-communist. Fascism presents itself as being anti-liberal, anti-conservative, and anti-communist. Now you might say, okay, so what the hell's left? That's the point. For fascist ideology, that's the point. It's a total rejection, or at least it claims to be, because there's two different things: how fascism presents itself to the world and how it really is.
It's the utmost reaction is the
Yes.
thing. It is
Yes.
so reactionary that
Yes.
it can't necessarily grapple to a single ideology concretely. That it kind of it like I've always said that fascism eats itself, because that very much is the case. There's always has to be an outgroup, a person to blame. And it's like, when you say that there's, hyphenated fascism, well, it's like, German fascism, which would be called Nazism. Their outgroup were the Romani people, Jewish people, and communists, and many other, minorities like gay people and trans people and all of the things. But I think that the idea that is universal with fascism is that there always has to be an outgroup bogeyman to persecute. And not just to persecute, but to go through the steps and process. Like there always has to be a group to persecute in order to have something to do, I feel. And the thing is about fascists is they are also one of the, they're always perfectly fine with getting in bed with capital.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. An old friend and comrade, who is like, to my mind, the most outstanding anti-fascist in the U.S. today, is a journalist named Chip Burley, who's written a lot about the radical right in the United States. He's a fantastic writer. But he once said to me in a personal conversation, he once said to me, fascism is like a flasher. It's got this overcoat of petty bourgeois radicalism that at any given moment, it's going to rip open that overcoat and show you it's monopoly capitalism underneath.
Right. And it really is monopoly capital trying to desperately maintain itself by any means possible. Like that is very much what it is. I mean, if we think about the most extreme version of fascism that has existed, which I would argue is the Nazi state.
Yes.
We can see, who were the levers of power, and how exactly did the Nazis become so powerful? it wasn't just because, you know, they had some popular support um, with people in Germany who were, struggling immensely after the First World War. It was also the fact that they were being bankrolled. You know, they had a lot of money coming in from German capital and also American capital, because a lot of these capitalist groups were mainly terrified of a German communist movement taking over after the First World War. The country was in it was in shambles. I mean, it was bad after the First World War. So the population was ripe to accept anything that could alleviate these stresses. And there was a price for that. You know, accept fascism, and sure, the money will start flowing in, but this will become an extremely fraught situation regardless.
I think that goes to show the inexorable link between capitalism and fascism. If you look at, the things that Nazi Germany did, you had, not just concentration camps where, people know that there were people from all different backgrounds, put to death, but there was all kinds of forced labor. I know, there are probably plenty of examples of, um, just German citizens taking pay cuts, do your duty for the fatherland,
Mhm.
and, all these investors, like you said, it was not just German capital, but American capital as well. And I'm sure plenty of other places, they saw lots of money to be made, not just from that, the cheap labor and all that, but, from providing to this war machine that just had to keep rolling. They need more tanks, they need more guns, and they were ready to throw all the money they had at it to keep it going, and see those profit returns just keep coming. Regardless of the costs, from human lives and suffering. Um,
But
Yeah.
but here you come back to the question of, okay, so what makes fascism different from other forms of repressive capitalism? It's like I said when you started off saying, people just say, oh, that's repressive, that's fascist. No, no, no. Fascism is something very specific. And it's distinct from other forms of the repressive bourgeois state. It is distinct from military. I mean, they could overlap, but it's distinct from military dictatorship. It's distinct from clerical reaction. It's distinct from what's been called bureaucratic authoritarianism. Fascism is something very specific. And it only begins to really come together when you look at, all right, so what are the characteristics that all fascist movements have in common? And that's where it becomes stark. Because they do have definite qualities and characteristics in common, definite commonalities. So right from the get-go. Okay, so the three negations, right? Anti-communist, anti-liberal, anti-conservative, strong emphasis on the anti-communist. And that was the big attraction for many people who would later join fascist movements, the anti-communism. But going further, so that anti-conservative, and that's important because fascism is not conservatism. I mean, we were kind of joking before we went on the air here. People say George Bush was a fascist. No, he wasn't. He was a reactionary. He was a lot of things, but he wasn't a fascist.
Right.
And I'm not saying that to sugarcoat George Bush. No, I'm saying that to draw a line of distinction so that we can really understand what we're dealing with. And so, fascism is anti-conservative to the extent that it wants to create a new nationalist authoritarian state. Every word there counts. A new nationalist authoritarian state, not just using old examples, not just propping up the past. There's a dividing line between fascism and quote unquote regular garden variety conservatism. So that's number one. Then number two, fascist economics. Fascism, and here you really see where it serves capitalism. Fascism puts forward this idea of what's been called the corporate state. And people have really misunderstood that because there's a famous quote from Mussolini that everybody, whenever people talk about Italian fascism, someone always throws this out. Pardon me, where Mussolini said, fascism is the merger of corporate and state power. And people will foolishly think, oh, he means businesses, corporations. Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, that's not what he's talking about. He meant corporate in a sense that's kind of alien to most Americans. He meant corporate in the medieval sense, a corpus, a body of people, so that soldiers form a corpus, upholsterers form a corpus, cabinet makers form a corpus, farmers form a corpus. He was thinking more in terms of medieval guilds. That's what he meant by the corporate state. And then further, the idea that the state drowns out class struggle. And that's what the Nazis meant by National Socialism. You know, one of the things, again, that you hear all the time, especially from the right, Hitler was a socialist. Oh, bullshit.
Oh my God.
Hitler
No, he
was not.
wasn't.
Well, actually, he was a national. He was not a socialist. He was a national socialist. Well, isn't that the same thing? No, it isn't. Because what the Nazis meant by National Socialism was a community of the race,
Yes.
a Volksgemeinschaft, which literally means a community of the race, a community of the folk. So that whether you're rich, whether you're poor, whether you're a worker, whether you're a banker, it doesn't matter because you're in it for Germany.
Right, an ethnic identity. There is
Bingo.
like an ethnic,
Bingo.
yeah, like it's about drawing on those lines of ethnicity as like a deciding factor. And forgive me if I'm wrong about this, but the whole corpus thing reminds me a little bit of like anarcho-syndicalism.
Oh boy, yes.
There's gonna be some angry
Yes.
fucking anarchists in my comment section. There's gonna be some angry anarchists.
They need to catch up on their reading then, I think.
There was one Italian fascist, I think it was Giovanni Gentili, who said fascism is the true anarchism.
Oh my God.
And there were a number of anarcho-syndicalists, especially in Italy, who immediately signed on to fascism.
Yes.
And that corporate state, that idea of a kind of a guild society is what appealed to them. When when Mussolini created his chamber of corporations, everyone was represented, but represented on a corporate basis. So there were soldiers' deputies, there were bankers' deputies, there were steel workers' deputies, there were automobile workers' deputies, and they were all in the same union. So you and your boss are in the same union because your union isn't organized on the basis of class, it's organized on the basis of corpus. So the whole point was to drown out class struggle in nationalism. And that's the meaning of phrases like National Socialism or national corporatism, or what the Spanish fascists said, and some of your listeners are going to really flip out on this one, national syndicalism.
No, yes, it's very much like it's almost a rejection of the class struggle.
Absolutely.
Um,
Absolutely.
and it's very like it is the epitome of reaction, and it's why I think that fascism is also something that can't really sustain itself very easily. It is one of those situations where it's like, the Spanish, you had oh, why am I forgetting his name now? Oh, I forgot what was the Spanish Civil War? The guy. The
Franco.
fascists. Franco.
Franco. Well,
You know.
Franco's not to go off on a tangent, but
Yeah.
Franco's a really interesting case study because he wasn't a fascist. He was, if you really wanted to characterize Francisco Franco, he was an extremely reactionary, authoritarian Catholic.
Right.
But
And
he was willing to use fascism when it benefited him. Because
exactly.
you had the Falange, which was the actual Spanish fascist party. But once the Civil War started, Franco basically castrated the Falange. He ordered their separate units to dissolve, and he had the Falange merge with other right-wing groups.
Right. And it's because it's the realization of it's self-preservation is what it's about. It's about the realization that the fascists can't necessarily sustain power. It is such an unstable ideology that it requires a constant outgroup. You have to do so much work to maintain it, you know. And I think that it for a lot of extremely reactionary right-wing dictators and leaders who haven't gone all the way but have certainly utilized it, they have had that realization and that understanding of, okay, if I'm going to maintain my power and influence and get in bed with the fascists, I have to realize that I have to take a knife with me.
Oh, yeah. And Franco is the perfect example of this because he eliminated the original. Well, first of all, the kind of guru of Spanish fascism was a guy named Jose Antonio Primo de Rivera. Extremely well educated, extremely intelligent, and he created the Falange. Well, come the Civil War, he ends up, Primo de Rivera ends up on the Republican side. So he was executed by the Republicans.
Well,
And well deserved, but he was executed by the Republicans. And so Franco then eliminated all the actual, quote unquote, genuine fascists who were around Primo de Rivera, replaced them with Franco loyalists, and then had the Falange merge with various monarchist groups and Catholic groups and created a new organization. So instead of the Falange Española, the Spanish phalanx, the new organization was now called, in a typically wordy Spanish.
Yep.
We love big words. We love big titles. It became the Falange Española Tradicionalista y de las Hons.
Oh my God.
So the Spanish phalanx, traditionalist. Now the traditionalists were these extremely right-wing Catholic monarchists, and of the Hons. And the Hons stood for the Junta Ofensiva Nacional Sindicalista. So the National Syndicalist fighting squads.
There's that again,
Yeah,
syndicalism.
there you go again. So he basically destroyed the original Falange and had them merge with all these other groups, and that became now his umbrella party. And so long as he was getting support from Hitler and Mussolini, and so long as the war was going in favor of the Axis, Franco played up the fascism, even though he was smart enough never to join in on the Axis side. And that's why he died in his bed and not in an underground bunker blowing his brains out
Or hanging upside down.
or hanging upside down in a public plaza. But then the war starts turning against the Axis. What does Franco do? He starts playing up to the British and the Americans.
Oh yeah, and
come the Cold War, he's the friend of democracy. He's the friend of the United States.
oh yeah, no, and that's the thing about that's so interesting about the Americans in this situation and the West in this whole situation of fascism and what it is and what it isn't is there's an interesting, I think, argument and I'd say well-researched argument about how a lot of like the Nazi ideology was derived from American exceptionalism, like the colonial ideology that had developed around the Americas. And a lot of it was designed around the genocide of the natives and the subjugation of Black people.
Manifest Destiny.
Manifest Destiny. Yes.
Lebensraum.
Lebensraum,
Yeah.
of course.
It's the same thing.
And so the Americans are really no stranger to these concepts, which is why I think it's very unsurprising and why I get annoyed at people who are surprised at this fact, that the Americans are so willing to cozy up to, basically help fund right-wing dictators, put them in place, fund death squads and everything. And it's because, they started this game in a lot of ways. Now, the fascist ideology, not necessarily. But a lot of the groundwork that was laid for specific fascist parties to pull from, mainly the Nazis, the Americans and the West were huge in that. And I would say another figure that I think about is Winston Churchill. He is so like he's one of the figures from World War II that's held up as hero, which I'm like, okay, how can y'all be a hater of Joseph Stalin and uphold fucking Winston Churchill? Okay, whatever, it's fine. Winston Churchill famously, or I guess not so famously, has been, if you've seen his writings on other ethnicities, people, and about colonialism and all of these different concepts, he is he's probably one of the most genocidal people I've ever read against, especially, well, I mean, this actually happened, but like the Bengal people, Indian people.
Well, what gets people, what people don't understand about Churchill, and before I say another word, in a certain aspect, Churchill for me is one of those people that you love to hate.
Right.
Because on the one hand, he did, well, first of all, yes, he was behind the Bengal genocide. He was extremely racist. He himself said that he liked Mussolini.
He's also very
And
anti-Semitic.
extremely anti-Semitic. He also supported Franco. That what people don't get, because then they say, well, he was the great anti-fascist. No, he wasn't. He was the great British nationalist. And his opposition to Hitler, and then later Mussolini when he joined Hitler, wasn't ideological. It was geopolitical. They were a threat to British imperialism.
Exactly.
They were the new kids on the block. They were challenging British colonialism.
The real opposition to Winston Churchill was not the fascists in Germany or Italy. It was the communists in Russia and the Soviet Union. Like and the reason is because they were the actual direct opposition to everything that British imperialism stood for. I think
that's one of the things that led up to World War II was it wasn't just the communists in Russia, it was the communists all over were beginning to rise. And like that's why you see these maybe not, direct specific, alliances, but Churchill was, praising Mussolini and I don't know if Franco was in power at the time, but they were, maintaining the status quo of, bourgeois dominance over the world and imperialism and all of that.
Well, there's a very telling quote from Churchill that explains him, that totally explains him and explains his role. And that's at some time during the war, he wrote a memo to his staff or whoever, but he wrote this kind of explanation. And he said, and I'll try to do my best Churchill impression. He goes, our enemy is not Hitler and Nazism. Our enemy is the German Reich.
What?
Think about what he's saying. Our enemy isn't Hitler and Nazism. It's the German Reich. It's geopolitics.
It's the German form of colonialism.
Right. It's the Anglo-French dominant form of colonialism. Now they're being challenged by these new colonialists
It's like, wait a
who,
second, that was
who
our
want their
idea
share of the
first.
pie.
Yeah, no, and it's the fact that, Winston Churchill was not opposed necessarily to Nazi ideology or fascist ideology. He was opposed to their threat to British imperialism and British nationalism,
And the British Empire.
and the British Empire,
Yeah.
and which is why he was so opposed to the quote Nazi scourge.
Right.
He wasn't really opposed to anything that they necessarily thought. It was simply how they opposed his identity as a British imperialist and nationalist.
Now,
And
to be fair to Churchill, heaven help me. To be fair to Churchill, I think once because once the truly monstrous nature of the Nazi regime, which outstripped even other forms of fascism in its brutality, then yeah, he could say Nazism is a tyranny unparalleled in the history of human crime. I should put on a show. I could do the Churchill impression.
Yeah, it
Should
wasn't
do a
bad.
one-man Churchill show.
one man show on Churchill, the life of
Um,
Churchill.
but yeah, so we'll grant him that. We'll grant him that. But I think the point is that no, he wasn't opposed to fascist ideology. He was opposed to what he felt was this new rising power that was a threat to the British Empire.
Right. And I think that, um, especially with, it really, really pisses me off with the way that people talk about Stalin. But, they're so willing to, basically, dick ride Churchill and be like, oh my God, he was the great leader during the war. He was one of the great leaders and the blah 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 blah. Just glazing him to high heaven. Um, when he wasn't even necessarily an anti-fascist.
It's
And
hard to maintain a good reputation when, not only do you have the capitalists in other, in foreign nations, talking bad about you, but then you have Khrushchev coming up right after, completely trashing Stalin too. So there was really no, prominent figures on his side after his death.
I know, and it's incredibly sad because it's like when you realize how much sacrifice the communists in the USSR made to defeat fascism for real, and do and really carry a lot of really, like, if it hadn't been for the Red Army, we would be speaking German, you know. Um, but there's this unfortunate prominent idea that somehow the Russians were they were sloppy, or they were just as bad, or blah 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 blah, which is just historically inaccurate. But then this, like, this upholding of Winston Churchill, who was such a hateful person, truly, who was like a repugnant human being on so many levels. And it just makes me like, it's just one of those situations where I'm like, okay, if we really want to get an accurate look at fascism, then we have to be honest about who our world leaders are, and where the real levers of power are, and stop, subscribing to these to propaganda, and just untrue statements and narratives about people who uphold our own version of events, you know?
Well, let's look at the propaganda then, because there is the whole question of fascist ideology, and that's what makes it different. So, all right, so we already said, the anti-communist, anti-conservative, anti-liberal wants to create a new nationalist authoritarian state. The corporatist, anti-class struggle economics. But then there's more. Imperialism and some kind of aggressive attitude towards the world order. Like, we have to find our place in the sun. We deserve our cut of the pie. Why should the British and the French take it all? We want colonies too. There's that. But then on top of that, the total militarization of social life so that everything in society is subjected to a military style discipline. The creation of a private army, a private militia, the black shirts, brown shirts, a philosophy of irrationalism, which manifests itself in different ways, either um, a hearkening back to some romanticized past, like Mussolini. Oh, we're going to recreate the Roman Empire, or the German Nazis. We need to go back to the Wagnerian medieval.
We need to make America great again.
We need to make America great again. This romanticized past. Also a strong dose of irrationalism and, well, I said irrationalism, mysticism and occultism. A lot of the Nazis were very big into occultism. So that strong dose of irrationalism and kind of reactionary romanticism. On top of that, male supremacism. And the Nazis spelled this out. The place of women in the new order, the new Germany they were creating, was going to be children, church, and children, kitchen, and church. That's the role of women. Now, this is not to say that there were not female fascists. There were, top of the list, Eva Perón in Argentina. But there were female fascists. But male supremacism, strong element. A cult of energy and action and youth. The fascists always contrasted their own leaders and their own members with the members of the other parties. And they emphasize, we're the young, we're the strong, we're the energetic. People tend to, whenever people think of Hitler, they always think of him during the war. And the war aged him. But if you look at Hitler in the years that he was coming up to power in the 20s and early 30s, he was very young. I think he was in 40-something when he comes to power. And certainly the fascists that were around him tended to be on the younger side. They were the World War I generation. People who came of age only 15, 20 years before. And this emphasis on health and vitality and strength. I would love to see a newsreel of this, because I'm sure it's out there. But when the Italian fascists were parading, the last few steps before they mounted the podium and went on the reviewing stand. So they're marching down the street, the reviewing stand is there, they've got their banners and they're wearing their black shirts. But the last few steps, they would rip off their shirts and run bare-chested up to the podium. I'd love to see a newsreel of that. It must have been hilarious to watch.
That's very funny.
But again, it was to show their manliness and their energy and their talent. And then probably the last thing, the worship of a godlike leader, whether it's a duce or Führer or a very old-fashioned Spanish word that no one uses anymore, but was one of Franco's titles, caudillo, which means boss or strongman.
Right.
So whether it's the duce or whether it's the Führer or whether it's the caudillo, it's this godlike leader that stands above us all that we must all follow.
Huh.
Now, notice there's one thing I didn't say. Notice I didn't say racism.
Right.
Now, racism is an essential part of German fascism. You can't be a Nazi and not be a racist.
Right.
It's essential. Now, but you could be, when I emphasize could, be an Italian fascist or other varieties of fascism and say, well, I'm not a racist, but I believe in the Italian people and the Italian nation. And then you go, yeah. Tell me how you're not a racist.
Yeah.
Tell me how you're not a racist again. But it's not an essential part the way it is in Nazism. Now, anything that is so nationalistic and so militaristic and so aggressive as fascism is, racism is going to follow. But the difference between, and I suppose this is the difference between Italian fascism and German fascism, is that in the Italian case, racism kind of flowed from fascism. In the German case, it was an essential part of it from the get-go. Do you see that?
Right. No, they had to, like the German fascists, what the interesting characteristic for them as well is you know, like I said, you know, they were one of the most extreme forms because, you know, we all know about the concentration camps and, you know, the mass murder of Jewish people and other ethnic minorities and just minorities in general. Um, you know, the persecution of people. But you know, that was extremely heightened for German Nazism specifically. Um, but that doesn't necessarily mean it was a heightened characteristic for all fascist regimes that
Right,
have existed.
right. And I think if you take all those things that we said, all those characteristics, and put them together, now you have fascism. And that's what makes it different from other forms of the repressive bourgeois state. When you put together the fascist contradictions, when you put together the militarism, when you put together the romanticism, when you put together the irrationalism, the cult of youth and violence and power and energy, when you put together the male supremacism, when you put together the cultish aspects of a supreme leader, put that all together, now you have fascism. And now you see how fascism is different from other forms of bourgeois repression. It's a very unique category.
Right. Marcus, did you want to add anything to that?
I did just want to say, I find it fascinating. There are obviously many parallels that can be drawn to today's political climate in America, in the United States, I should say. Um, and I do find it funny because I don't know, I haven't seen anything like this recently, but I noticed like political cartoons that were supportive of Trump. If you look at them, definitely during his first term, you know, he is not a very fit person, okay? But when you look at these cartoons and drawings that people that were in support of him, he always looked like he was like like a pro wrestler in their prime, the
Oh
flat stomach,
yeah.
broad chest,
Mm-hmm.
and it's like they're really trying to push that whole, masculine kind of ideal out there, even though it's couldn't be farther from the truth. Um, and if you don't mind me going off on my own small tangent here, you know, as Marxists, we're taught to look at material conditions, and something I've been thinking a lot about, as things develop here is, um, and this harkens back to um, what I was saying before from fascism and social revolution that, fascism is often capitalism in decay. Um, now uh, I say we, but the United States was in a very unique position post World War II. You know, uh, Obviously most of Europe was in ruins. A lot of the Pacific was as well. Um, and the United States was one of the only, great powers to come out more or less unscathed, at least as far as, manufacturing capabilities. Um, like we didn't really have any big invasions here in the United States. So they were uniquely positioned to take advantage of that, whether it be through economic deals with Europe while it was in ruins, um, or more direct control, like you would see over the in the Philippines and in Japan, especially. I believe MacArthur was more or less the dictator of Japan for a good while. And it this situation that the United States found itself in, it was very, very well placed to show itself as the upholder of freedom and democracy and all these things. And when in reality it was all the exploitation was just happening outside of view. We were exporting, not just capital, but the suffering that produced that capital was not felt and not seen within the United States, which is why, in a similar fashion, make America great again. We would go back to the good old days, where, our imperialism and exploitation of workers was, that was exported and we didn't have to think about it. And this, because it took a long time for these other countries to, rebuild their manufacturing and their production bases. We were able to keep this facade going for so long that in our current situation that we're facing, we really don't have a, a very strong leftist opposition to what is happening right now, because there are so many people that really believe that, there wasn't that exploitation happening overseas. Like we were pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps here and you know, doing all this ourselves. And but in the current situation we find ourselves in, like I think the best example would be China. Everything is built in China, right? We were exporting labor in China for a very long time in a very massive scale, and that exploitation was what maintains the ever increasing profits while maintaining, you know, the prices staying relatively low to where we can afford, oh, you could work in a warehouse, working a little over minimum wage and afford a house and things like that. Well, China is very developed now. They're they're in a much stronger position, and so is much of the rest of the world. And there's really not many, if any, places to exploit in the way we have for so long. And but we see all this, they call it inflation. Wages are stagnant because I don't know what other BS reasons they come up with, but they can't exploit people overseas anymore, and it's starting to affect us here at home. And I don't think a lot of people realize what has led up to this happening. And they're blaming the immigrants. It's the same thing, but we don't have such a strong, like intelligent, leftist opposition to this, because like the last ones we had here have been gone for almost 100 years. It's been like for 80 years we were coasting on foreign exploitation, and now it's starting to come home. And like I really believe there are a lot of people waking up to this, but it's nothing compared to what there was, you know prior to World War II, which, as we were saying, led to a lot of the reactionary politics of the bourgeois to maintain their status quo and their position in in the class warfare. So
Right.
it's a very, very, very different situation. And even Trump said, like, I expected much more of a fight from the left,
What
because
left?
Yeah.
exactly. Um just being able to wake up myself, and just by looking at history and doing a little bit of reading, like like everything lines up.
I'm glad you
It's
said that. I'm glad you said that, Marcus, because there's a lot of people out there, people on the left, and they have good intentions, but they're coming to a bad conclusion. And what I mean is this, because there are people out there who will say, fascism is the bourgeoisie's response to a revolutionary situation. So this can't be fascism.
That's not necessarily true.
Absolutely.
That's not,
Absolutely.
like,
Absolutely.
there may have been instances where that might have been true, but that's not across the board.
I think that the problem is people are drawing that conclusion from reading like some of the early communist writers on fascism, reading Arpalm Dutt and reading Togliatti, the Italian, or reading even Dimitrov. And no dishonor or disrespect to them, but they were writing in 1935. They didn't see different variations of fascism evolve that we have. So they were
Right.
drawing their analysis based on what they saw, which was natural, normal, absolutely. But today,
Conditions changed.
conditions change. And what I think is happening in this country is kind of, it's a slow burn. The fascism that we're seeing today is a reaction not to an immediate uprising 2 years ago. It's a reaction to the 60s. It's a reaction to the 70s. It's the reaction to the gains that were made by social and people's movements in the 70s, especially, that sort of became consolidated. It was a reaction to the civil rights movement. It's a reaction to the gay liberation movement. It's a reaction to the collapse of American capitalism. It's a reaction to this revolution, if you will, but that took 40 years.
Yeah, it's a reaction to social change that
Yeah.
has incrementally developed over many, many generations and decades, that has fundamentally changed things but at the same time, not necessarily, because the same levers of power are still in place, and these things can be ripped away at any time. It's the fact that, these movements were extremely grassroots. I think about the civil rights era, especially. And they weren't just given to people, it's something that people had to actively fight for. And so, I think that it's this a very interesting observation, most certainly, trying to understand, where did fascists in America really begin to, where is their point where America stopped being great, right? And yeah, they
Wasn't
would.
really great to begin with.
It wasn't.
Well,
It wasn't great. It wasn't great to begin with. But to them, that greatness stopped when America started to quote, in some way, shape, or form, capitulate. Even though a lot of this was, it was grassroots movements who were, fighting for their own liberation, as they should, and under a bourgeois state that can rip it away at any time. Which is why, like, the real threats were neutralized quickly. The Black Panthers were neutralized very, very fast, violently as well.
They
And
chopped the head right off of that organization very quickly.
literally,
literally.
literally they did. And it's because, when we think about, like, civil rights today, even a lot of American fascists who think about civil rights today, they're very incorrect about what it actually was. Like, they always bring up MLK and, oh, he was the good one, right? MLK was a lot more radical than people give him credit for.
Yeah, not only that, but that's not what they said at the time.
Yeah, no, he was extremely disliked, and it's
Yeah.
because he was so outspoken. But it's always this concept of respectability, and, oh, well, he was a respectable civil rights leader. He was but the thing is, um, the thing is with that, is that he, like, that's not at all how it went down. This was a movement that had been developing over a period of years, that MLK happened to be coming up at the time that it was becoming more feasible to actually demand for a civil rights action to be taken.
And in my,
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
I just think, and I don't want to diminish or you know, downplay the importance of the things that they did. But with my understanding of social democracy, and as we were saying, I believe in the beginning of the session here, social democracy ends up, um, really, um, what's the word? Enabling fascism to come to power. And I think, with those material conditions that we find ourselves in now and over the past 80 years, I think we have taken social democracy and really pushed it to the farthest limits that we have ever seen, and possibly as far as it can go. And now that, the like as I was saying before, those the system that has been propped up for so long with so much exploitation is starting to crumble. That they're starting to pull back on those advancements made through social democracy um, that we were able to achieve because of those conditions that we were in, and with the capitalists could afford to base more or less throw us those breadcrumbs to keep us, satisfied and not, you know, start building up a revolutionary movement. And it's kept us satisfied. It's kept them satisfied. But that era is coming to an end, in my opinion, and that is why we find ourselves in the situation we are in today.
If you were to ask me, what was the moment when fascism was really put on the table as an agenda in the United States? I would say it was with the Reagan campaign. Now, as I said, there had been this, like I said, slow burn reaction, this increasing resentment and anger at the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the gay liberation movement, the gains that were made in the 70s. All that was building. All that was building. But then, come Reagan's 1980 presidential campaign, the Republican Party, Christian bargain, and I use that word advisedly, with the religious fundamentalists.
Yes, they did.
That's when fascism was put on the table.
I believe, I don't know
Because
if
people
it
have
was
talked
Reagan
about
or
American
maybe it was,
fascism, people have talked about Christo-fascism, Christian nationalism. And well, who said it? I think it was it Sinclair Lewis who said when fascism comes to the United States, it's not going to come wearing a black shirt and jackboots. It's going to come draped in the American flag and holding a Bible.
Right.
absolutely.
Yeah, some of the utmost reaction has come from the church and from religious institutions, um, which is it's because religious institutions also have a vested interest in maintaining the class structure, um, and maintaining capital because they make a profit. They, even if they're meant to be quote non for profit, or they're not supposed to, that's not supposed to be the deal, right? That's very much the reality is very different. But as we come to a close, I think it is important to recognize the current fascist state that we're living under, which is the Christian fascist state. And it does not begin with Trump, and it does not end with Trump.
No, not at all.
Donald Trump happened to be the manifestation at the time that he was coming up politically of that movement that was convenient. It was very easy to say, to glom onto his message and for him to glom onto theirs, because Trump is not ideological.
No, absolutely not. I have no proof for this, for what I'm about to say. I have no evidence for this, but I can so easily imagine in 2008 when Obama was elected. I can easily imagine this happening. I can easily imagine a secret meeting of top white supremacists and neo-Nazis and Klansmen meeting in Idaho in the Metzger complex, and they're all there. And they're all saying, "Oh, an N-word became president. We can't allow it. We can't. We got to do something about it. We should run one of our own people." And David Duke saying, "No, we can't do that. That wasn't work. We got to find someone else. We got to find someone who doesn't have a political idea in his head, but who wants to be president, whose vanity we can play on. Maybe who has some money of his own. And if he's got celebrity status, that'll even help more." And Steve Bannon jumping up and saying, "I know just the guy."
Yep. Yeah, and it's because, also, in the context of, the American capitalist class, and everything that they do, and stand for, this was only a matter of time. Trump is very much the amalgamation of all of this, like like American reaction and what capital does to a person and how it changes you fundamentally, and how class society and these conditions really change people's perspectives on who is representing us truly. And Trump really is like the true representation of the capitalist class who the American capitalist class, that is so willing to get into bed with fascists because they truly they have no ideological ties. There is nothing going on in that brain. Simply burger. But no, burger. But no, I think it's really, it's incredibly, and this should be an ongoing conversation because we haven't even, this is the tip of the iceberg. We haven't even gotten into
we just scratched the surface tonight.
We have just scratched the surface today, but I hope that this episode was a good starter for a lot of people who are interested in the communist perspective on fascism first and foremost, but also what are truly the characteristics and how do we identify this? Because I feel like, okay, who did a Barbenheimer back when Barbie and Oppenheimer came out? I think it was summer of 2023 or 2024, one of the two.
I did Oppenheimer, but I did not see the Barbie movie.
I saw the Barbie movie. I'm just gonna put that out there right now. I saw it on opening day. It was fun. Okay, it was fun. But there's this scene in Barbie where Margot Robbie walks up to the girl she thinks she's supposed to she thinks she's gone into the human world to meet and talk to. She goes up to this girl and she goes, "Hi, I'm Barbie." And this girl basically goes on this short monologue where she's like, "You're a terrible person." And then at the end she's going on this tangent and she goes, "And you're a fascist," to Barbie. And you see Margot Robbie, Barbie, she's like, "Oh, okay." And she walks away and she starts crying and she's like, "I don't control the levers of commerce." But that scene to me was so interesting because it made me realize just how much this term is thrown around and how much it's not understood.
Mm-hmm.
And there is this broad understanding of how capitalism is tangentially connected to fascism, but there's not really an understanding of the true essence of fascism and how it works and who, what are the levers of control and power. And so I hope that we can continue to have this conversation. So thank you, comrades, for coming on the show.
Well, it was my pleasure.
Yes, thank you so much for having me.
Wonderful. So I'm going to go ahead.